Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, Symphony number 17. And this particular symphony, I really would like you to consider in contrast to Symphony number 16. So if you haven't seen the previous chat on Symphony number 16, I do urge that you watch it, because this symphony is the complete opposite of Symphony number 16. Symphony number 16, you may recall, was a very gracious, warm, comfortable, snuggly, chamber-like symphony that was based almost entirely on the working out of the simultaneous combination of melodies. That is, counterpoint that was reversible. That made the symphony very compact, because when you can do two things simultaneously, present melodic ideas simultaneously, you can do them in less space. Now, number 17 compared to number 16 is incredibly expansive. It's not interested in counterpoint, not a bit. It's all about linear development in time of a huge range of motives and ideas that, for the purposes of textbook sonata form, we group into what is called a first subject and a second subject. But what this symphony tells us, and it is a lesson that cannot be emphasized strongly enough, is that there is no limit to what goes into a first subject or a second subject. They could be single melodies. They could be a dozen motives. It could be absolutely anything. It could be just a rhythm and a melody. It could be a melody and 6 motives. It could be 5 melodies and 23 motives. It makes absolutely no difference, because the organizing principle is tonality. It's where the tunes and motives and ideas happen, not how many of them there are. Now, as a result of this linear approach, this movement is one of Haydn's longest first movements in his early symphonies. It's over 7 minutes long. And the reason is because it's so developmental. And actually, the entire symphony is that way. As we've seen with all of these other symphonies, Haydn sees these symphonies as complete works, and he relates them together not with shared melodic ideas so much as with shared conceptual or technical or formal processes. And this symphony shows that particularly vividly. The first movement, and oh, by the way, we're going to hear the whole symphony. We have no choice, because in a symphony which is based entirely on intense motivic development, you've got to hear the whole thing from beginning to end in order to understand what Haydn is doing. And what he does is so marvelous. I mean, it's absolutely fabulously fun to listen to. Of course, I'm going to play it without repeats, and I've edited it down. But, this is, you can always go back and listen to it again if you want to hear it, if you want to repeat it. So that doesn't matter so much. But the point I want to make is that when you're working with motives the way Haydn does in this symphony, it gets longer. It inevitably gets longer in your development sections, because he's going to begin to show us what he can do with all of those motives. However, in order to bind the whole work together, not only is he sharing the same type of themes and formal working out of those themes, but he also is uniting the work in terms of tonality, which is based around the key of F major, F minor. The slow movement in this symphony is actually in the minor key, which is quite splendid, which gives it a certain spooky grimness, which is very, very appealing and aesthetically pleasing. And what you will hear is that as the symphony goes on, this contrast between major and minor also gets exploited from movement to movement. And that is also a binding factor that unifies the entire work. But let's start at the beginning. Now, the first movement could be called monothematic sonata form. And one of the things I always pointed out is that monothematic sonata form, which means a movement which is based on one theme, tends to have more tunes than movements that are not monothematic. Isn't that a paradox? It really isn't. What it really means, as I've said before, is that Haydn front loads the thematic material. That is, it's all based on the introductory or initial idea. But that idea begins developing from the very, very beginning. And so the movement is really a constant source of ongoing development where one basic motive or idea generates succeeding ideas. And it's all organized in sort of an overarching sonata form, but I don't think you should pay attention to that. What I really think you should do when you listen to this first movement is consider how many different motives there are, how many different ideas he can work with, all spun out by that same opening gesture. The opening gesture is just dum bum bum ba ba dum ba da dum ba ba da da dum. That's basically it. That's your opening gesture. Especially that first little phrase, dum bum 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 ba ba dum, or however it goes, you'll hear it. That thing keeps coming back. And whether it's in the first subject or the second subject or the development, it generates all kinds of quite different succeeding ideas. Some of them are rhythmic, some of them are more melodic, some of them are major, some of them are minor, but they all clearly arise from that initial thrust of energy. It's like sending up a rocket and seeing where it lands each time in a slightly different place. I mean, that's what Haydn is doing in this movement. And so it isn't necessary to think about sonata first subjects or second subjects or expositions and developments, because the whole thing develops ongoing. I mean, that's a characteristic, of Haydn, and it's a particular characteristic of the symphonic working out with musical motives. It's a purely symphonic concept that Haydn evolves and that no other composer shared to the same degree that he did. Nobody. Not Mozart, only maybe later Beethoven, when he began doing stuff like that. And this is where he got it from. And you can hear it so clearly in this symphony. So the first movement of this symphony, without repeats, is still over 3.5 minutes long. It does a lot because that opening motive generates a lot of ideas in the exposition, which generate more ideas in the development, which are elaborated and extended even in the recapitulation. It's one giant celebration of the initial thematic idea. So let's listen to the Toronto Camerata under Kevin Mallon on Naxos in the entire first movement, without repeats, of Haydn Symphony No. 17. And just listen to how many different ideas Haydn packs into it and how they change and evolve as the music goes on. That's all you need to know about it. It's just about listening. Good, involved, active listening. Here we go. I think it's pretty clear what I was talking about, right? I mean, sometimes we hear that opening gesture so many times we're not actually sure where we are in the movement at any given time, because we could be going back to the beginning, we could be going forward. You don't know. There's that wonderful element of surprise, and it only all comes together at the very, very end when we realize that, yes, we have reached the end of the symphonic journey that Haydn has set out on. And it's so much fun to listen to this particular symphony and this movement in contrast to the first movement of Symphony number 16, where everything is tightly woven, counterpoint, and you can turn it upside down and right side up, and it's just based on a couple of ideas, where here there's just a cornucopia of things happening, but all based on that initial gesture. Now, the second movement, the Andante, is for strings only, and it is also in monothematic sonata form. It's exactly the same form as the first movement, but it couldn't sound more different. What it does have in common is that very extensive development section, because once again, Haydn is taking an initial idea that has many different components. You might call it a single melody that breaks up into different bits, or a series of motives that are assembled to form a longer melody. However you look at it, it doesn't really matter. What you will notice is that the second subject happens to be simply a major key version of the first subject. So it is monothematic, as was the first movement. There's a very lengthy development section and a recapitulation in which, because in a recapitulation everything gets stated in the home key, and the home key is minor, that minor key second subject is going to be, the major key second subject. Minor key is the first subject, major key is the second subject. It's going to be restated in the minor. But because it's the same tune as the first subject, Haydn doesn't have to do it at all. He's already given it to you in the minor. So the recapitulation is foreshortened, and it goes directly to the concluding idea, and hence to the minor key ending, which stays in the minor key. It's just a wonderful, wonderful example of logical thinking on the sonata scale. And so listen carefully. I'm going to indicate with superscriptions where the first subject, the second subject, the development, the recap, etc. So you'll know very, very clearly exactly how the form operates in this movement. It's really a wonderful way, this movement, to understand what happens in a sonata movement, especially one in a minor key, where you're dealing with the idea of monothematicism, even where there are lots and lots and lots of ideas in what is theoretically a single-themed movement. It's just so sophisticated and clever and emotionally very, very affecting, because it gets darker and creepier as it goes. And the development section has some very disturbing harmony in it, as you'll hear. It's marvelous. So have a listen now to the slow movement. Now, the finale is much simpler than either the first or the second movement. It, too, is essentially monothematic. It's all based on the initial idea, and it has a first and second subject. But in this particular case, whereas in the second movement, the order of events went minor key, major key, this finale does just the opposite. It's going to go major key, minor key for the second subject, which eventually will lead to a major key conclusion. So it's a mirror image, in a sense, of what we heard in the slow movement. But more importantly than that, because it's a finale, and finales have to be lively and more relaxed and easier on the ear and less intellectually sophisticated than what we heard before. That's the classical rule in these 3-movement or 4-movement symphonies. The actual development section, such as it is, really doesn't exist. There's only a tiny little bridge passage. And that is, in a sense, what the development section was originally, back in the dawn of time. If you listen to these binary or 2-part movement sonatas that are called sonatas, such as like Scarlatti sonatas, for harpsichord, or a lot of CPE Bach's keyboard sonatas, what you found is that in the original proto-primal sonata form concept, the idea was that the 2 parts of the movement were connected. There was a link that led you back to the recapitulation. That lead back became a development section in the hands of Haydn, basically. He figured out that rather than just going back to the beginning, and that's a form, by the way, which was still used in Haydn's day. We've already talked about it. We've talked about sonata forms without development in slow movements. Mozart loved it. That's the form of his overture to the Marriage of Figaro. Theatrical overtures, generally speaking, in sonata form don't have development sections because they're overtures. You got a whole other thing coming after it. You don't want to get involved in a big development section. And so that idea was still valid in Haydn's day, but he expanded on it, and you can hear all 3 or 2, really, sonata types, that is sonata with development and sonata without development, in this symphony, all based on the same concept of a monothematic sonata form in which the initial idea generates a whole sequence of spin-offs and sequels and related and new ideas as the music progresses. This is the symphony of power. It is the word of power. It is the mystery behind symphonic construction, the symphonic concept. This is the kind of thing that was new, completely new to the classical period, and which Haydn was going to carry to absolutely Empyrean heights in his later symphonies. You can hear it in one of its most concentrated, essential forms in this wonderful, wonderful little F major symphony. So here now is the finale without repeats. You can hear the whole thing. And you may notice that the opening gesture is quite similar to the gesture that opened the first movement as well. So you see, This is symphonic construction. In later works, Haydn is going to begin to synthesize all of these various elements, the counterpoint from the 16th, the motivic working from the 17th. All of this stuff becomes material that he can use and combine in quite literally an infinite number of ways. I mean, once you have the basic technique under your fingertips, in your hands, there's no limit to what you can do, and there's no limit to the number of combinations and expressive angles and explorations that you can make. And that's what's so wonderful about these early Haydn symphonies, because we can hear him experimenting and enjoying working with each element separately and then together and in different proportions. But because these are generally short and entertaining pieces, we can enjoy doing it. They tell us what they're doing while they're doing it, and they please us while expressing a whole gamut of feelings and emotions. It's just one of the unbelievable glories of our musical world, and a privilege to be witness to this process as Haydn begins to show us how to invent the symphony and the classical style, which frankly has been the main musical style ever since Haydn invented it, and it still is today. It's in many ways it still is. So keep on listening. Number 17 is now in the bag, and number 18 is one of Haydn's most experimental and unusual early symphonies. I can't wait to get to it, and I'll see you there. Take care.